He boarded the plane like any other passenger, wearing a simple hoodie, carrying a small backpack. But when a flight attendant kicked him off in front of everyone, she had no idea she was about to destroy her own career and shake the entire airline industry. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a new one. They thought he didn't belong. When Nathan Brooks walked onto the plane wearing a simple black hoodie and jeans, he drew more than a few looks. His face was calm, but his hands tightened slightly around the strap of his backpack. First-class passengers, dressed in sharp suits and expensive watches, glanced at him and then quickly looked away. Nathan found his seat near the window, quietly slipped his backpack under the seat, and pulled out an old paperback novel. He tried to ignore the stares. Flying first class was supposed to feel special. Instead, it already felt like he didn't fit. Ms. Ramsey, the lead flight attendant, noticed him almost immediately. Her smile, tight and professional, slipped slightly when her eyes landed on Nathan. Straightening her skirt, she marched briskly down the aisle, stopping beside his seat. Her shadow fell over him. "Boarding pass," she demanded, her voice clipped and cold. Nathan kept his face calm, reaching into his hoodie pocket and pulling out the crumpled boarding pass. She snatched it from his hand and stared at it longer than needed, as if she expected to find something wrong. After an uncomfortable silence, she shoved the pass back at him without a word. Nathan tucked it into his backpack, hoping that was the end of it. But Ms. Ramsey stayed rooted to the spot, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "You're in the wrong section," she said loudly enough that a few nearby passengers looked up. Nathan kept his voice even. "This is my assigned seat," he replied. His words were polite, but he felt the heat of embarrassment rising. Ms. Ramsey gave him a long, hard look, then spun around and disappeared behind the thick curtain leading to the galley. Nathan could feel the tension crackling in the air. Mr. Green, a businessman seated across the aisle, lowered his newspaper slightly, watching the scene with a frown. Nathan opened his book again, pretending to read, but his stomach twisted. Something told him this wasn't over. He had flown enough times to know when trouble was brewing. A few minutes later, Ms. Ramsey returned, and this time she wasn't alone. Behind her walked Peter Wallace, a younger flight attendant who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Ms. Ramsey didn't even try to keep her voice low. "Sir, you need to leave the aircraft immediately," she announced, sharp and final. Conversation in the cabin died away as every head turned toward Nathan. He looked up slowly, blinking. "Why?" he asked, his voice steady even as his heart raced. Ms. Ramsey crossed her arms. "First class is reserved for properly dressed passengers. Hoodies aren't acceptable attire," she said. The words hung heavy in the still air, heavier than the thick carpet under Nathan's feet. Nathan shut his book, slipped it into his backpack, and stood up without saying a word. His face stayed calm, but inside something broke loose, something cold and powerful. He slung the backpack over one shoulder, ignoring the eyes that followed him. As he moved down the aisle toward the exit, he pulled out his phone and typed a message quickly. No anger, no outburst, just a quiet command sent with a few taps. He slid the phone back into his pocket and walked off the plane, knowing something they didn't. They thought they had pushed him out. What they had really done was open the first door to their own fall. Nathan stood just outside the boarding gate, the cool air from the terminal brushing against his face. His fingers tightened around the strap of his backpack as he watched passengers continue boarding without a second glance. He stayed calm, standing off to the side where no one would bother him. Inside the plane, Ms. Ramsey returned to her duties with an extra snap in her movements, feeling proud of what she thought was a job well done. Peter Wallace lingered behind, uncomfortable with how things had unfolded but too afraid to speak up. First class returned to its soft hum of chatter, but a few passengers exchanged glances, whispering under their breath. Near the front of the plane, Mr. Green, the businessman, shifted in his seat, his expression troubled. He tapped his fingers lightly against the armrest, watching the flight attendants move about with forced cheerfulness. He had seen enough to know that something wasn't right, but like most people, he told himself it wasn't his place to interfere. Meanwhile, out in the terminal, Nathan pulled out his phone again. His hands moved quickly, sending another message. He kept his face blank, his posture relaxed, giving no hint of the storm quietly building behind him. Back inside the aircraft, Ms. Ramsey chatted briefly with Peter, her voice low but sharp. "We have standards to maintain," she said, smoothing her skirt with a satisfied pat. Peter nodded weakly but looked away, his stomach knotting. He didn't agree, but years of watching people like her taught him that speaking up could make you a target too. At that moment, a buzz ran through the crew's earpieces. The pilot's voice came through, calm but firm, instructing all flight attendants to report to the front galley immediately. Ms. Ramsey straightened, adjusting her uniform with quick, sharp movements. She didn't notice Peter's uneasy glance toward the terminal doors. As they both headed to the front, they passed several first-class passengers who now wore curious expressions. Whispers floated between seats, quiet but growing. "Did you see what happened?" someone murmured. "He had a ticket, didn't he?" another whispered. The atmosphere, once filled with polite small talk, now felt thick with tension and the heavy sense that something wasn't right. Nathan remained near the window of the terminal, his hoodie still pulled up, his face calm and unreadable. People passed him without a second look, assuming he was just another kid waiting for a later flight. He leaned casually against the wall, his phone still in his hand, as he watched two sharply dressed men in dark suits walk briskly toward the boarding gate. Their movements were purposeful, their faces serious. As they approached, the gate agent stiffened. A few exchanged worried glances, sensing trouble even before a word was spoken. Nathan slipped his phone back into his pocket and pushed off from the wall, following the two men toward the gate with slow, deliberate steps. Inside the front galley, Ms. Ramsey stood with her arms folded, her face set in a mask of professionalism. Peter Wallace stood slightly behind her, his hands clasped nervously. The captain, a tall man with a weathered face named Captain Reynolds, addressed the crew with a tight voice. "We've been informed of an urgent situation regarding a passenger removal," he said. "Stay alert and cooperate with any instructions from the ground team." Ms. Ramsey lifted her chin proudly, assuming the captain would back her decision. She didn't notice how Peter shifted uncomfortably beside her, avoiding eye contact. At the boarding door, the two suited men flashed badges at the gate agents, who quickly stepped aside. Without a word, the men boarded the plane, their footsteps firm and deliberate. Passengers craned their necks to watch, their conversations dropping to murmurs. One of the suited men, a broad-shouldered man with steel-gray hair, scanned the cabin before locking eyes with Ms. Ramsey. Without smiling, he gestured for her to step forward. "Ms. Ramsey?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. "Yes," she answered, straightening her jacket and flashing her best professional smile. "Step into the jet bridge with us, please." A ripple of whispers spread through the cabin. Peter's face drained of color as he watched her follow the men out. Mr. Green leaned forward in his seat, his instincts telling him that something bigger was happening. Ms. Ramsey walked stiffly, confusion flickering across her face. In her mind, she had done everything right. She had protected the image of first class. What could possibly be wrong? Nathan watched from just beyond the gate as the scene unfolded. His heart pounded steadily in his chest, but his face showed nothing. He knew exactly who the two men were. He had spoken to their office not 10 minutes ago. As Ms. Ramsey disappeared into the jet bridge, Nathan shifted his backpack higher on his shoulder and moved closer, just within earshot without making himself obvious. The taller of the two men leaned in toward Ms. Ramsey. "We've received a formal complaint about your handling of a first-class passenger," he said evenly. "We're here on direct orders from the executive office." Ms. Ramsey blinked, struggling to understand. "I was following protocol," she said quickly. "He didn't meet the appearance standards for first class." The man's jaw tightened slightly. "We've already reviewed the boarding records. The passenger in question had a fully confirmed premium fare ticket. And for your information," he added, his voice sharpening, He's no ordinary passenger. Confusion turned to alarm on Ms. Ramsey's face. What do you mean? She asked, her voice suddenly smaller. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, directly at Nathan, who now stood quietly nearby, his hoodie still up, his expression unreadable. Ms. Ramsey followed the man's gaze and locked eyes with Nathan for the first time since throwing him off the plane. Her breath caught in her throat. Something cold and heavy slid down her spine. She didn't know who he was yet, but from the look on the executives' faces, she understood one thing very clearly. She had made a mistake, a big one, and it was only just starting to unfold. Nathan stood still, his hands tucked inside the front pocket of his hoodie, his head slightly tilted as he watched Ms. Ramsey try to piece together what was happening. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her face, once full of authority, now showed cracks of fear and confusion. The taller man, who had introduced himself simply as Mr. Jennings from the executive office, stepped closer to her. His voice dropped low enough that only those standing nearby could hear. You removed a premium passenger without cause, Mr. Jennings said, each word deliberate. That alone is a violation. But you didn't just remove any passenger. You removed Nathan Brooks, heir to the Brooks Aviation Group, the primary owner of this airline. Ms. Ramsey's mouth fell open, but no sound escaped. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to wake from a bad dream. Peter Wallace, still watching from inside the plane, saw her stiffen like a statue. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see enough to know that something had gone terribly wrong for her. Inside first class, the atmosphere remained tense. Passengers exchanged quiet, uneasy glances. Mr. Green leaned back in his seat, folding his arms. He hadn't known who Nathan was, but he didn't need to. What he had seen was enough. Now the truth was unfolding, and judging from the faces of the airline staff, it wasn't going to end quietly. Ms. Ramsey struggled to form a response. I didn't know, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look. She stopped herself too late. Jennings raised one eyebrow slightly, unimpressed. You judged him based on appearance, he said. And now you've embarrassed this airline in front of dozens of first-class passengers, plus whoever else hears about this after today. He gave a short nod toward the gate, where more uniformed airline officials had begun arriving, their faces serious and tight-lipped. Nathan said nothing. He simply watched. His silence was louder than any accusation. It made Ms. Ramsey squirm where she stood. Every second dragged on her like a heavy weight. Effective immediately, Mr. Jennings continued. You're relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Further disciplinary action will be determined after a full review. Ms. Ramsey opened her mouth again, but Mr. Jennings was already turning toward Nathan. His voice changed, now respectful. Mr. Brooks, we sincerely apologize for the way you were treated. Your seat is ready whenever you are. We'd like to escort you personally. Nathan gave a small nod, the first hint of emotion breaking across his calm face. Without looking at Ms. Ramsey again, he adjusted his backpack and followed the executives back toward the plane. Behind him, Ms. Ramsey stood frozen, her face burning with shame. The noise of the terminal suddenly seeming much louder than before. Every passerby, every whisper, every click of a suitcase wheel felt like a hammer striking her pride. Nathan didn't even glance back. He didn't need to. Her downfall had already begun. As Nathan walked calmly toward the aircraft, escorted by Mr. Jennings and the other suited official, passengers peered through the open doorway, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Whispers stirred like a current through the first-class cabin, each guess and assumption more urgent than the last. Peter Wallace stood near the galley, his posture stiff as he watched Nathan approach. His heart pounded, knowing this wasn't just an ordinary situation. Something heavy hung in the air, and Peter wasn't sure if he should step forward or stay frozen where he stood. Mr. Green, who had been quietly observing everything, leaned back slightly in his seat, his eyes never leaving Nathan. There was a sense of respect in the way he watched, a silent acknowledgement that the young man who had been humiliated minutes earlier now carried the weight of quiet authority that no amount of expensive suits or polished smiles could match. Nathan paused at the door before stepping back into the aircraft. He glanced briefly around the cabin, locking eyes with several of the passengers who had watched him get kicked off without saying a word. Some dropped their gazes quickly, ashamed. Others, like Mr. Green, held his gaze with an almost apologetic look. Nathan didn't smile. He didn't need to. His calmness was its own kind of storm. Ms. Ramsey remained out of sight, kept behind by the ground officials who were now gathering information from the gate agents. The sound of papers rustling and urgent whispers floated faintly from the jet bridge. But the tension in the cabin was sharper, cutting through the polished air like a blade. Mr. Jennings gestured to Nathan's original seat, his voice low and formal. "Everything is ready for you, sir. We have also arranged a full cabin service at your convenience. Please let us know if there's anything you need." Nathan nodded once, his expression neutral. He stepped into the aisle and returned to his seat by the window, slipping his backpack back under the seat. Around him, passengers shifted uncomfortably, not knowing whether to say something or stay silent. A few rows back, an older woman whispered to her husband, "That poor boy, treated like that, and he owns the airline." The whisper was meant to be quiet, but it carried. Nathan heard it, but gave no reaction. He placed the worn paperback novel gently on his lap and looked out the window. The afternoon sun gleamed against the airport windows, but the bright light did little to soften the heavy, unsettled atmosphere inside the cabin. Peter Wallace, still standing stiffly near the galley, gathered his courage and moved closer. He knelt slightly by Nathan's seat, keeping his voice low. "I'm really sorry about earlier, sir," he said, his voice shaking a little. I should have said something." Nathan turned his head slowly to look at Peter. His face was calm but unreadable. After a long pause, he said quietly, "Sometimes silence speaks louder than words." Peter's face flushed deep red. He nodded quickly and stepped back, swallowing whatever apology he had been about to say next. Across the aisle, Mr. Green gave a soft grunt of agreement under his breath, loud enough that Peter heard him but said nothing. The engines hummed steadily as final preparations for takeoff resumed, but nothing about the flight felt normal anymore. Every clink of a buckle, every soft announcement seemed heavy with what had just happened, and what was still unfolding. Nathan leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes briefly, feeling the hum of the engines beneath him. He knew this wasn't finished, not even close. There were things already moving behind the scenes that Ms. Ramsey and others hadn't even begun to realize. Actions had consequences, and this time, they wouldn't be brushed under the rug. As the cabin door finally closed and the plane prepared to push back from the gate, Nathan opened his eyes and looked forward calmly. The flight might have been taking off, but something much bigger was about to land, and it was coming straight for the ones who thought appearances were all that mattered. The plane slowly rolled away from the gate, the low rumble of the engines filling the cabin. Nathan remained still, staring out the window as the airport buildings blurred past. He didn't bother looking around. He could feel the eyes on him. Every movement he made, every quiet breath, seemed to draw silent attention. People were uncomfortable, unsure how to act now that they knew who he was. Some passengers shifted awkwardly in their seats, pretending to check their phones or adjust their seatbelts, anything to avoid facing the quiet truth sitting among them. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, Peter Wallace moved quickly through the first-class cabin, handing out drinks with a politeness that now felt forced. His hands trembled slightly each time he passed Nathan's row. He knew he had been a part of something ugly, even if only by standing back and letting it happen. Peter delivered a bottle of sparkling water to Nathan's tray table, murmuring another apology so soft that Nathan barely caught it. Nathan simply nodded without speaking, a gesture that carried more weight than 1,000 words. Across the aisle, Mr. Green watched it all unfold. He admired the boy's calmness. It wasn't the kind of quiet that came from weakness. It was the kind that came from knowing you didn't need to shout to be heard. Mr. Green made a mental note to tell the airline what he had witnessed when the time came. They needed to hear from more than just the ones who had suffered. They needed to hear from those who had seen and said nothing too. Meanwhile, in the back of the aircraft, tension thickened among the crew. Ms. Ramsey had been escorted off the plane before takeoff. None of the passengers saw it happen. The airline had done it quickly and quietly, but the other attendants knew. They exchanged anxious glances, whispering to each other behind closed galley curtains. No one wanted to be the next to make a mistake. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds glanced over the incident report that had been rushed to him before departure. His frown deepened with every line he read. A passenger thrown off first class for wearing a hoodie, and that passenger turning out to be the owner's son. He had seen many things in his years flying, but this would follow the crew longer than any rough landing or bad weather ever could. Back in first class, Nathan leaned back against his seat and pulled out his phone. He wasn't scrolling mindlessly or killing time. Instead, he opened his email and reviewed the draft a legal assistant had already prepared. It detailed the full timeline of the incident, from the moment he boarded the plane to the moment he was removed, including the inappropriate remarks made about his appearance. Everything had been recorded: security footage, witness statements, even the messages sent by airline employees had been quietly captured by the systems tied to Nathan's ownership rights. He hadn't needed to raise his voice. The system itself had recorded the truth for him. With a few taps, Nathan finalized the message and hit send. It traveled instantly to a dozen inboxes: legal teams, media relations heads, corporate boards, and most importantly, the airline's CEO, Charles Whitman. Nathan slid the phone back into his hoodie pocket and closed his eyes again, feeling the plane steady as it climbed higher above the clouds. The real turbulence was still ahead, but it wouldn't shake him. In the rows behind him, passengers whispered more boldly now. They talked about the unfairness they had witnessed, about how easily people judged based on clothes and skin. Nathan heard it all but didn't react. Words were easy. It was action that mattered. He wasn't interested in apologies whispered when it was safe. He was interested in what people would do when it mattered. A flight attendant quietly approached Mr. Green's seat, offering him another drink. Mr. Green declined with a polite shake of his head, then leaned slightly across the aisle toward Nathan. His voice was low but firm. "If you ever need a statement," he said, "I'll back you up. What happened wasn't right." Nathan looked at him for a long moment. For the first time since reboarding, he allowed a small, polite smile to curve his lips. He nodded once, then returned his gaze to the window. The city was long behind them now, and endless skies stretched ahead. Up here, nothing was hidden. Everything was seen. And when the plane finally landed, it wouldn't just be Nathan stepping off as a passenger. He would be stepping off as a reminder that no one could strip someone's worth based on what they wore or how they looked. Not anymore. Not ever again. The flight continued in strained silence, the usual soft conversations replaced with heavy, thoughtful quiet. Nathan remained still in his seat, the soft hum of the engines almost masking the tension that gripped first class. Passengers glanced at him from time to time, guilt flickering in their eyes before they looked away. Even the sound of glasses clinking or ice rattling in cups seemed muted, as if the whole cabin held its breath, waiting for something they couldn't name but knew was coming. Peter Wallace returned once more, this time offering a warm towel, his hand slightly steadier than before. He lowered his voice, almost whispering, "Please let us know if there's anything you need, sir." Nathan gave a slight nod but said nothing. He didn't need their words now. What was happening had already moved far beyond towels and polite gestures. Near the middle of the cabin, Mr. Green shifted, pulling a small notebook from his briefcase. He began scribbling quietly, his brow furrowed. He wasn't just going to wait to be asked for a statement. He was writing down everything he had seen, every glance, every comment, every move. He wanted to be ready. People like Ms. Ramsey counted on others staying silent. Not this time. As the flight continued cruising above the clouds, Nathan's phone buzzed quietly in his pocket. He slipped it out and glanced at the screen. A simple text message blinked back at him. Action underway. CEO notified. Board preparing response. He smiled inwardly, a slow, almost invisible shift at the corner of his mouth. The gears behind the scenes were moving exactly as planned. The airline had a choice to make. Either they took responsibility now, or they watched their reputation crumble under the weight of a single bad decision. Meanwhile, in the back of the plane, the remaining flight attendants gathered near the galley, whispering fiercely among themselves. Word had spread quickly. Rumors flew about Nathan's connection to the airline, about the meeting executives were supposedly scrambling to hold even before the plane landed. Some attendants looked nervous, others angry, but none dared speak openly. They knew someone was watching now, and mistakes would no longer be brushed aside with a quiet apology and a transfer to another route. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, breaking the heavy silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are stowed." The announcement sounded routine, but there was a subtle tightness in his tone that the passengers picked up on. First class stirred slightly, passengers shifting in their seats, adjusting blankets, closing laptops. No one spoke loudly. It felt like the entire cabin was holding its breath for more reasons than just landing. Nathan sat up straighter, feeling the subtle dip of the plane as it began its slow descent. Out the window, the sun had started to sink lower, casting golden streaks across the clouds. The world outside looked peaceful, but inside, the real storm was only gathering strength. His hands rested lightly on his knees, relaxed but ready. In a seat 2 rows behind him, a woman murmured to her husband, "Do you think they know who he is now?" The man gave a soft snort. "They'll find out soon enough," he muttered, folding his arms across his chest. The city skyline appeared in the distance, sharp against the horizon. Nathan's heart beat steadily as the plane moved closer to the ground. He wasn't angry. Anger burned hot and quick, easy to snuff out. What Nathan felt was colder, deeper, a kind of determination that didn't fade, the kind that changed things forever. As the tires touched the runway with a soft screech and the engines reversed with a roar, Nathan leaned back in his seat. This flight was over. But for the airline, the real turbulence was just about to begin. The plane rolled steadily along the runway, the cabin filled with the familiar sounds of descent, the hum of slowing engines, the clatter of overhead bins rattling slightly, the soft beep of seatbelt signs flashing above. Yet beneath all the normal noise, a strange tension gripped every seat. First-class passengers fidgeted in their spots, stealing glances at Nathan as if expecting some kind of announcement, some final confirmation of what they all now suspected but dared not say aloud. Nathan remained calm, his gaze fixed out the window. The skyline blurred past, the terminal buildings growing closer with every second. His breathing stayed even, his body relaxed against the leather seat. Outwardly, he looked like any other teenager traveling alone. Inwardly, he was already preparing for the next stage, the moment when quiet accountability would no longer be optional for the people who had wronged him. As the plane slowed to a crawl and finally came to a full stop at the gate, the captain's voice returned over the intercom, slower and heavier this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we are parked at the gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. We also request your patience during disembarkation, as there will be some necessary security procedures." Passengers exchanged puzzled looks. Security procedures? That wasn't standard. A ripple of whispered speculation moved through first class like a passing wind. Peter Wallace, standing near the galley, looked pale. He understood exactly what was coming, though he didn't dare voice it. Instead, he mechanically went through the landing checklist, checking seatbelts, securing loose items, all while his mind raced. The plane's door finally opened with a soft hiss. Nathan stayed seated, making no move to stand or collect his things. Around him, passengers began gathering their belongings, though many kept throwing glances toward him, hesitating. It was as if they instinctively knew that this was not an ordinary exit. Something about Nathan's stillness, his patience, made them slow down. uncertain whether to push forward or wait. Within moments, 2 more men in dark suits stepped onto the plane. They moved with quiet authority, speaking briefly to the head attendant before making their way directly to Nathan's row. One of the men, a tall figure with a shaved head and sharp eyes, spoke with calm respect. "Mr. Brooks, we're here to assist you and escort you through the terminal. The executive team is waiting." Peter Wallace shifted awkwardly by the galley, pressing himself against the wall to make room as the suited men addressed Nathan. Passengers nearby leaned forward, eyes wide with realization. The quiet boy they had seen wearing a hoodie wasn't some lost teenager. He was someone the airline was now scrambling to appease. Nathan nodded once, collected his backpack from under the seat, and stood up slowly. He slung the strap over his shoulder and adjusted the hood of his sweatshirt before stepping into the aisle. For a moment, a hush fell over the cabin. Even passengers in business class, separated only by a thin curtain, fell silent, sensing something unusual unfolding. As Nathan moved down the aisle toward the exit, Mr. Green rose from his seat without a word and stepped aside, offering a respectful nod. Nathan returned it briefly, the ghost of a polite smile passing his lips. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by the other passengers. Some shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting the judgment they had so easily made earlier. At the front of the plane, a small group of executives stood waiting inside the jet bridge. Their suits were pressed, their shoes polished, but the nervous energy rolling off them was impossible to hide. Nathan stepped through the aircraft door without hesitation, his steps steady, unhurried. Behind him, whispers rose louder among the passengers. "Did you hear?" someone said. "He owns part of the airline," another added. "No wonder the staff looks terrified." Peter watched Nathan disappear into the jet bridge, a sinking feeling curling in his stomach. He knew he had just witnessed something much bigger than a boy being mistreated. He had witnessed a lesson, one that he wouldn't forget. As Nathan stepped onto the carpeted walkway, the executives stiffened and straightened their ties. One of them, a tall man with graying hair and a rigid smile, stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "Mr. Brooks," he said quickly, "I'm Robert Hayes, Vice President of Customer Relations. We deeply regret what happened today and are ready to assist you in any way necessary." Nathan didn't shake the offered hand. Instead, he simply said, his voice even and clear, "You'll have a lot more to regret before this is finished." The executives fell silent, their fake smiles flickering for the briefest moment. They knew then. This wasn't just a bad look for the airline. It was about to become a reckoning. The executives exchanged quick glances, the weight of Nathan's words settling heavily between them. Robert Hayes cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to recover some sense of control. "Mr. Brooks, if you'd like, we can escort you to the VIP lounge while we arrange transportation. We want to make sure you're comfortable after this inconvenience." His words came out too carefully, too rehearsed. It was clear he wasn't speaking from concern, but fear of what might follow. Nathan adjusted the strap of his backpack, his posture relaxed yet commanding. "I'm fine," he said simply, his voice steady. "What matters isn't comfort, it's accountability." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calmness cut sharper than anger ever could. Without another word, he began walking down the jet bridge, leaving the executives to stumble after him. As they moved through the terminal, curious travelers turned to stare. The sight of executives practically chasing after a teenager in a hoodie wasn't something they saw every day. Nathan didn't acknowledge the looks. His eyes remained forward, his mind already working ahead. The legal team would be arriving soon. The media inquiries would follow. His family's firm grip on the airline's operations meant this wasn't just a private issue anymore. It was a corporate crisis. At the far end of the terminal, a sleek black car waited near a private exit, the driver holding the door open respectfully. Nathan stopped a few feet away and turned back to face the group of executives. His voice was still calm when he spoke. "Before you start offering free flights and loyalty points, understand something," he said. "This isn't about patching one mistake. It's about fixing a culture that allowed someone like Ms. Ramsey to act the way she did. Robert Hayes nodded quickly, sweat starting to bead at his hairline. Of course, Mr. Brooks. We're already preparing a full internal review. Sensitivity training, disciplinary actions. We'll make sure nothing like this ever happens again. His promises tumbled out so fast they almost blurred together. A few of the other executives murmured their agreement, each trying to look as committed as possible, their nervous smiles betraying them. Nathan's expression didn't soften. Words are easy, he said, his gaze steady. Actions are harder, and believe me, I will be watching every single one you take. With that, he turned and slipped into the back seat of the waiting car. The door shut softly behind him, cutting off the view of the stunned executive still standing frozen on the curb. The driver nodded respectfully in the rearview mirror. "Where to, sir?" he asked. Nathan leaned back against the leather seat, feeling the tension in his chest loosen slightly. "Headquarters," he said simply. "There's work to do." As the car pulled away from the curb, he glanced back once at the glass walls of the terminal. Through them, he could still see the executives scrambling, phones already pressed to their ears, panic beginning to bloom. Good, he thought. Panic meant they were paying attention now. Panic meant change might finally be forced into motion. Across the terminal, inside the first-class lounge, whispers had begun to ripple among the high-end travelers. Stories were already taking shape. A teenager in a hoodie, a wrongful removal, a hidden power revealed. Every retelling grew a little sharper, a little more damning for the airline. The ground beneath the company was starting to shift, and Nathan knew it wouldn't stop here. Inside the car, Nathan pulled out his phone again. Several new emails had come through in the last few minutes. One from the legal team confirming a meeting with the airline's CEO. Another from the family's PR representative, outlining how news outlets were already picking up the story. A third from his father, brief and supportive. "Handle it your way. We trust you." Nathan allowed himself a small, genuine smile for the first time that day. His way wasn't about public outbursts or angry threats. It was about setting a fire so carefully that no one could escape its heat. Not the guilty, not the cowardly, and certainly not the ones who thought they could judge someone's worth by the clothes on their back. The road stretched ahead, smooth and wide under the golden afternoon light. Nathan stared out the window, the city blurring past. The storm was no longer coming, it was already here. And it had a name now. The sleek black car cut smoothly through the traffic, weaving past slower vehicles as the skyline grew larger in the distance. Nathan sat quietly in the back seat, his face calm, but his mind sharp, calculating every move ahead. He wasn't rushing. Rushing was for people who panicked. He was patient, and patience was dangerous when wielded by someone who had already set events in motion before most even realized there was a problem. At the airline's downtown headquarters, a different kind of storm brewed. Inside the towering glass building, senior executives gathered in a private boardroom overlooking the city. Tension hung thick in the room. No one sipped the coffee offered. No one relaxed in their chairs. Every executive present had already read the incoming reports. One of the company's major shareholders, the Brooks family, had been humiliated in front of dozens of passengers, and word had already started leaking out into the media. The press office was scrambling to prepare a statement, but it wouldn't be enough. The board knew it. In the center of the long, polished table, CEO Charles Whitman tapped his pen against a folder marked "Confidential." His jaw was set tightly. Charles had weathered crises before, minor scandals, mechanical failures, PR stumbles. But this was different. This wasn't some nameless customer filing a complaint. This was Nathan Brooks, whose family controlled enough shares to demand changes far bigger than an apology or a reassignment. The assistant entered the room quietly and leaned close to Charles, murmuring, "Mr. Brooks has arrived." Charles straightened his jacket and nodded grimly. "Show him in." Moments later, the double doors swung open, and Nathan walked into the room, flanked by two senior legal advisors from his family's firm. He wore the same black hoodie, the same jeans. He hadn't changed his clothes for this meeting. He didn't need to. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere, forcing even the most arrogant executives to sit up straighter and lower their eyes for a moment. Charles stood to greet him, forcing a tight smile. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for coming." Nathan didn't return the smile. He simply moved to the empty chair opposite Charles and sat down, resting his hands lightly on the table. His advisors took seats beside him, their briefcases placed carefully within arm's reach. "Let's get to it," Nathan said, his voice low and steady. There was no grand speech from the CEO, no long apologies or meaningless promises. They all knew Nathan wasn't here for gestures. He was here for action. Charles cleared his throat and opened the folder in front of him. "We have begun a full internal investigation regarding the events of your flight today. The staff member involved has been suspended pending review, and we are already drafting new policies for handling premium passengers to avoid discriminatory behavior." His words were rehearsed, mechanical. Nathan listened silently, his face giving away nothing. When Charles finished, Nathan leaned forward slightly, tapping his fingers once against the table. "Suspension isn't enough," he said simply. "Suspension says you think this is just about one person making a mistake. It's not. It's about a culture you've allowed to grow unchecked." Charles opened his mouth to respond, but Nathan cut him off. "I'm not asking for another round of training workshops no one takes seriously. I'm demanding permanent changes, third-party audits, clear consequences for discriminatory behavior, from the top down, public acknowledgement of what happened, and a direct commitment to enforce those standards at every level, not just on paper." Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The PR manager scribbled notes frantically. Charles remained still, his face tightening slightly as he realized the scale of what was being demanded. "And one more thing," Nathan added, his voice colder now. "I want Ms. Ramsey's termination processed before the end of today. No quiet reassignment, no early retirement deal. A full, formal dismissal for cause, and I want that recorded and kept on file. Anyone who thinks appearance matters more than human decency doesn't belong in your company." The room stayed silent. No one argued. No one tried to soften the blow. They all knew he had the leverage to enforce every word. After a long moment, Charles nodded stiffly. "Understood," he said. Nathan sat back in his chair, satisfied but not smug. "Good," he said, "because if these conditions aren't met, I will make this public. And I promise you, it won't just be one airline's reputation burned. It will be an entire industry's reminder." The weight of his words settled heavily across the room. Some of the executives looked pale. Charles, to his credit, didn't flinch. He simply nodded again, scribbled a signature across the top page of the file, and slid it across the table toward Nathan's advisors. The meeting ended not with a handshake, but with an understanding far stronger than any formal agreement. Nathan stood, adjusting his hoodie, and left the room without a backward glance, leaving the so-called leaders sitting there, forced to reckon with the damage they had caused and the price they were about to pay for it. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city. Nathan stepped into the waiting car without hesitation, his face unreadable, his mind already focused on what came next. He wasn't finished yet. He had just taken the first step, and the echoes of that step would reach farther than anyone in that boardroom had ever imagined. The car slid back into the flow of evening traffic, the city lights starting to flicker awake as dusk settled in. Nathan leaned his head back against the seat, letting the soft vibration of the road run through him. His phone buzzed steadily against his leg with incoming messages, some from reporters eager for a statement, some from allies within the industry offering quiet words of support. He ignored them all for the moment. This wasn't about feeding headlines. This wasn't about attention. It was about making sure no one else would sit quietly, judged by their clothes, their skin, or their background, and be made to feel small again. Across the city, the ripple effects of the meeting had already begun. In hushed conference rooms, directors and managers scrambled to revise policies. Department heads rushed to review customer service standards. Quiet meetings were set up overnight to discuss new mandatory training, not just another slideshow that employees could click through without thinking, but in-person workshops monitored by independent auditors Nathan's legal team would approve. It was no longer a suggestion. It was a condition attached directly to his family's continued investment. Back at the airline's offices, Ms. Ramsey sat alone in a small, windowless room, waiting for HR to complete her final paperwork. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap, her face pale and tight. She had been given no chance to negotiate, no offer to resign quietly. The termination was immediate and permanent, stamped across her employee record. She had been in the company long enough to know what that meant. No clean recommendation letters, no smooth transition to another airline. She would carry the stain of her mistake everywhere she went from now on. Her mind raced back to the moment Nathan had boarded the plane, remembering the brief flash of irritation she had felt just at the sight of him. She had convinced herself she was protecting the airline's image, upholding its standards. But in truth, she knew now. She had been protecting nothing more than her own biases. Her hands shook slightly as she signed the termination documents. There was no sympathy left for her here, no last-minute reprieve. As she pushed the paper across the desk to the HR officer, a single thought echoed hollowly in her mind. I thought he was just a kid. Meanwhile, at home, Nathan's parents sat quietly in their living room, the news playing softly on the television. His father, Jonathan Brooks, a man known in business circles for his calm, strategic mind, watched the coverage without speaking. His mother, Caroline Brooks, shook her head slowly as a panel of commentators debated the incident. "They still don't get it," she said, her voice low. "They think this is about a boy and a hoodie." Jonathan nodded, folding his hands in his lap. "They'll learn," he said simply. Nathan made sure of it. Upstairs, Nathan sat at his desk, scrolling through the early reports starting to flood news outlets. Headlines blared across the screen. Flight attendant removes black teen from first class, not knowing he was the airline's owner. Appearance over rights, airline faces backlash after wrongful removal incident. Calls for industry reform grow after high-profile mistreatment case. The comment sections beneath the articles filled rapidly. Thousands of people, many who had never heard of Nathan or the Brooks family before today, shared their own experiences. Stories of being judged for wearing the wrong thing, looking the wrong way, speaking with the wrong accent. Nathan read them quietly, each one fueling the certainty inside him that this wasn't just his battle to fight. He drafted a short public statement on his laptop, choosing every word carefully. It wasn't angry, it wasn't vengeful. It was clear, firm, and full of purpose. What happened to me is not unique. It is a reflection of a larger issue that too many people face every day. I am fortunate enough to have the platform to demand change. Many others are not. This is not just about one flight, one airline, or one employee. This is about what we choose to tolerate and what we refuse to accept moving forward. Accountability isn't an act of revenge. It's the beginning of something better. He attached the statement to a formal letter addressed not only to the airline's leadership, but to the boards of several major aviation companies, encouraging them to adopt stricter anti-discrimination policies industry-wide. Nathan knew his name carried enough weight now that they couldn't simply ignore it. Before hitting send, he hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. He understood something many didn't. Real change wasn't about tearing down one person. It was about rebuilding a system that had been broken for too long. With a final tap, he sent the letter. He leaned back in his chair, feeling a deep sense of calm settle over him. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But today had been a start, a powerful one. In the distance, thunder rumbled faintly across the evening sky, low and steady like a reminder. Storms didn't ask for permission to come. They came when the air demanded cleansing. And tonight, Nathan knew, the air was finally beginning to clear. The following morning, the city woke to the full force of the story. Every major news outlet carried it on their front pages, Every social media feed buzzed with videos, opinions, and outrage. Images of Nathan, standing tall in his black hoodie at the airport, were everywhere. Headlines shouted across screens and papers. Teen owner exposes airline discrimination, demands industry-wide reform. Appearance isn't a crime. Nathan Brooks' powerful stand against bias. A hoodie doesn't define worth. Aviation giants under pressure after scandal. The airline's public relations department worked frantically through the night, issuing statements, posting apologies across all platforms, and promising immediate reforms. But no matter how carefully they worded their messages, public trust had been cracked, and cracks spread fast. Nathan watched the news from the kitchen table, a mug of black coffee in his hand. He hadn't slept much. His phone vibrated endlessly with messages from civil rights groups, reporters, even other business leaders who wanted to meet, to discuss reforms, to be seen on the right side of this growing movement. He didn't rush to answer any of them. Right now, his focus remained crystal clear. Change had to be real, not just cosmetic. His mother, Caroline, placed a plate of toast in front of him and sat down across the table. She studied him for a moment before speaking. "You did well yesterday," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "But this isn't just about fixing one company, Nathan. You realize that, right?" Nathan nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "I know," he said. "This is bigger now. It's about making sure this stops being something people expect to happen." Upstairs, Jonathan Brooks was already on conference calls with the family's corporate attorneys. Their aviation group wasn't just a shareholder in one airline. They had influence across partnerships, code shares, and international routes. Nathan had access to more than just a legal hammer. He had the ability to pull strings few even realized were connected. Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, chaos ruled. The CEO, Charles Whitman, paced his office as his senior executives bombarded him with updates. Early reports showed a massive spike in refund requests from customers citing loss of trust. Sponsors threatened to suspend deals. Flight bookings dipped by almost 15% overnight. Investors were demanding emergency meetings to discuss brand damage and future protections. Charles slammed his hand down on his desk, sending a stack of papers scattering. "One incident," he growled. "One kid. How could this spiral so far?" Across the room, Robert Hayes spoke carefully, knowing better than to trigger the CEO's temper further. "It's not just about the incident," he said. "It's about what it represents. People are tired of these stories. Nathan Brooks just gave them a face, a voice they can rally behind." Charles pressed his fingers into his temples, closing his eyes. "What's the status on the reforms?" "We've begun implementing Nathan's demands," Robert said. "Third-party audits are scheduled to start next week. We're revising training, and a full public acknowledgement will go live later today. But it's not enough." Charles looked up sharply. "What do you mean it's not enough?" Robert hesitated. "The industry is watching. Other airlines are reviewing their own policies. Some are already reaching out to Nathan, inviting him to help shape broader reforms. If we don't act faster, smarter, we'll lose not just face, we'll lose ground." Silence thickened the room. Back at the Brooks estate, Nathan finished his coffee and rose from the table. He grabbed his laptop and stepped out onto the patio where the early morning sun bathed the garden in golden light. Sitting down, he opened his inbox to find dozens of invitations to speak at conferences, lead panels, and consult for companies outside aviation, hotels, car services, even major event organizers who feared being the next target of public outrage. He scrolled through them carefully. He wasn't looking for applause or attention. He was looking for real partners, people willing to listen and act, not just nod along for the cameras. An email caught his eye. It was from the CEO of a competing airline, one that had long challenged the company now under fire. The subject line was simple: opportunity for real change. Nathan clicked it open. The message was short but powerful. "We watched what happened. We agree it's time for better standards across the industry." If you're willing, we'd like to work with you. Not just on one airline, but across all major carriers. Let's set the new standard together." Nathan leaned back, tapping his fingers against the table thoughtfully. It was tempting. Very tempting. Not for revenge. That wasn't what fueled him, but for the chance to build something lasting. Inside the house, his parents watched him from the kitchen window. Caroline smiled quietly. "He's not just fixing a wrong," she said. "He's building something better." Jonathan nodded, his arms folded across his chest. "He's changing the air they breathe. And they don't even realize it yet." Out in the garden, Nathan drafted a reply. One that wouldn't just accept the offer, but would raise the bar higher than anyone expected. Because for him, fixing a flight wasn't enough. Fixing a system was the only goal worth chasing now. Nathan's fingers moved steadily across the keyboard as he crafted his response. Every word mattered. This wasn't about a meeting for show. This was about drawing a line in the sand. When he finally finished, he read it over once, then hit send without hesitation. The email was professional but firm. If they wanted his help, it would be on his terms. Real reforms, transparent results, and a seat at the table where decisions were made, not just token gestures. He closed his laptop and stood, stretching as he looked out across the sprawling gardens. The sun was higher now, casting sharp, clean light across the neatly trimmed lawns. It felt symbolic. No more shadows, no more hiding behind polite lies. Within an hour, Nathan's phone rang. He answered on the first ring, already expecting the call. On the other end was Richard Collins, the CEO of the competing airline, his voice steady but respectful. "Mr. Brooks, I appreciate your quick reply," Richard began. "I want you to know, we're serious about this. We're prepared to make every change you proposed. We're not interested in looking good for a few weeks. We're interested in setting a new standard for the industry." Nathan listened carefully. He didn't hear the usual slickness executives often used. There was something different in Richard's voice, a mixture of urgency and something rare, sincerity. Still, Nathan wasn't someone who trusted easily, especially not when words were the only thing being offered. "I'm glad you feel that way," Nathan replied. "But you should know. If we do this, it's public, transparent, every step documented, every promise tracked. This isn't about one airline getting ahead in the news cycle. It's about setting something so solid no one can ignore it." Richard didn't hesitate. "We agree. I've already spoken with our board. We want you involved from the start, in training design, policy review, hiring practices, full access." Nathan paused, letting that sink in. This was more than he expected, more than he had dared hope for after the long, frustrating battles he had watched others fight, only to see real change slip through their fingers. "Send me the details," Nathan said finally. "If everything checks out, we move forward. If it's smoke and mirrors, you won't just lose my support, you'll hear from me publicly." Richard's chuckle was low and dry. "Understood," he said. "No smoke, no mirrors. We're serious. You'll have the documents within the hour." They ended the call, and Nathan stared at his phone for a long moment. It felt strange. A battle that had started with a single humiliating moment on an airplane now stretched across boardrooms and industries. And somehow he had become the point where all the anger, the exhaustion, and the hope of so many people converged. He wasn't naive. He knew real change wouldn't happen overnight. He knew the fight would be messy, political, frustrating at times, but for the first time it felt possible. Not a dream, but a plan. Inside the house, Jonathan Brooks entered the living room holding an envelope. He handed it to Nathan without a word. Nathan opened it and found an official letter from the original airline, the one that had kicked him off the plane. It was a formal apology signed by every senior executive, including Charles Whitman. The letter promised reforms, donations to anti-discrimination causes, and a standing invitation for Nathan to join a newly created advisory board overseeing passenger equality policies. Nathan read it slowly, then folded the letter neatly and set it aside. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He knew apologies were easy to write when public pressure twisted your hand. True test came later, in the quiet moments when no one was watching, when it was tempting to slide back into old habits. His mother watched him carefully. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Nathan shook his head slightly. "Thinking about the ones who don't have a name big enough to force a meeting," he said. "The ones who get kicked off a flight, denied a service, judged and shoved aside, and no one listens." Caroline's expression softened. "You're listening now," she said. Nathan nodded slowly. "Not just listening," he said. "Pushing. For them. For everyone who ever sat silent because they thought it was just easier to walk away." That evening, news broke that not one, but 2 airlines had committed to major reforms under Nathan's guidance. News anchors debated what it meant for the future of customer service, for corporate responsibility, for young leadership in industries dominated by old thinking. Headlines began calling it the Brooks Standard. Nathan didn't care much about the title. Titles faded. Attention moved on. What mattered was making the changes real, permanent, untouchable once the cameras moved on. Sitting quietly in his room, the night growing darker outside, Nathan opened his laptop again. He drafted another letter, not to executives this time, but to the public. A promise, simple and clear. This isn't the end of a story. It's the start of a standard. One we build together. One we refuse to compromise. He scheduled the letter to post first thing the next morning. The storm he had started was no longer a threat. It was already reshaping the skies, clearing a path not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And Nathan Brooks intended to make sure the sky stayed clear for a long, long time. The next morning, the scheduled letter went live across all major platforms. Nathan's words were simple, but the effect was immediate. Within an hour, his message was trending worldwide. Hashtags flooded timelines. Brooks Standard, dignity in flight, change takes flight. People from every corner of society, students, parents, business leaders, even retired pilots, shared the letter with their own stories attached. Tales of mistreatment, stories of silent humiliation in airports, hotels, restaurants, stories that had gone unheard until now. Nathan scrolled through some of the posts from his home office, the early sunlight stretching through the tall windows. His heart was heavy but steady. He wasn't proud of what had happened to him. He would never call it lucky. But he understood now that sometimes change didn't start with a carefully planned speech or a corporate initiative. Sometimes it started with someone being pushed too far and refusing to stay silent about it. Downstairs, Jonathan and Caroline watched the coverage on TV. Major news networks had moved beyond reporting the incident itself. Now they were talking about the bigger picture, systemic issues, accountability in customer-facing industries, the responsibility of corporations to do more than apologize after getting caught. The original airline that had thrown Nathan off the plane wasn't finished scrambling either. Overnight, they had rushed to issue a press release announcing the firing of Ms. Ramsey and the expansion of their anti-bias programs. They framed it as swift action, but insiders knew better. They hadn't moved because it was the right thing to do. They moved because they had no choice anymore. Nathan's quiet, measured actions had cornered them without him ever raising his voice once. Nathan's legal team fielded interview requests, panel invitations, and partnership offers all morning. They screened each one carefully. Nathan wasn't interested in becoming a media figure. He wasn't chasing fame. He wanted results. His team began drafting a proposal to create an independent nonprofit, an organization that would audit service industries for bias and mistreatment and publicly grade them. Not just airlines, but hotels, rental car companies, event venues, anywhere where customers could be quietly judged without consequence. Meanwhile, Richard Collins, the CEO from the competing airline who had offered Nathan a seat at the decision-making table, confirmed that his airline would be the first to fully implement the Brooks Standard. It wasn't just talk. He had already approved funding for external auditors, retraining for staff at every level, and a permanent committee chaired by a diverse panel of industry experts, including Nathan. For the first time in years, people in the travel industry began to believe real change might be possible. Across the country, in dozens of airport lounges, news played on mounted screens while travelers watched. Some smiled quietly, some clapped lightly when Nathan's speech replayed. Flight attendants whispered about it during boarding. Passengers nodded at each other when small acts of dignity and kindness were shown during flights. A culture that had long whispered about fairness now spoke it aloud. And Nathan stayed quiet, refusing interviews, refusing to pose for flashing cameras. He let the work speak for itself. He replied only to the emails that promised action, not praise. He knew the real test would come not today, not tomorrow, but in the years ahead when public attention moved elsewhere. Would the reforms hold? Would companies really change? He intended to make sure they did. In the late afternoon, Nathan received a call from Robert Hayes, the vice president from the original Airline. His voice was strained but respectful. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "the CEO asked me to personally invite you to lead an internal reform panel here as well. Full access, full authority. We'll do whatever it takes to regain your family's trust. And the public's." Nathan let the silence stretch a moment, making sure Hayes understood the weight of the request. Then, finally, he said, "I'm not interested in saving reputations. I'm interested in building something better. If you're serious, send the agreement in writing. No conditions, no control." Robert promised to send the documents immediately. Nathan hung up without another word. As night fell again, Nathan stood outside on the back patio, looking up at the first few stars beginning to pierce the darkening sky. The air was cooler now, the edge of autumn creeping in. He tucked his hands into the front pocket of his hoodie, the same one he had worn the day he was forced off the plane. It wasn't just a piece of clothing anymore. It was a symbol, a reminder of what he had been underestimated for, and what he had risen above. Behind him, the lights from the house glowed warmly. His family's laughter drifted out through the windows as they finished dinner. It was a normal night, a simple, peaceful night. And yet, somewhere out there, in corporate offices and airport boardrooms, in customer service departments and training rooms, the world was shifting because of what had begun with a single boy who refused to accept being treated as less. Nathan knew the work ahead would be hard, messy, frustrating. Change always was. But he smiled to himself, watching the stars come out one by one. They had underestimated him. They had mistaken silence for weakness. They had mistaken a hoodie for a reason to doubt him. And they would never make that mistake again. Not now. Not ever. Weeks passed, but the waves Nathan had created only grew stronger. What had begun as a single humiliating moment inside a plane's narrow aisle had now expanded into something much larger. A movement that couldn't be quieted by carefully worded apologies or polished advertising campaigns. Across the country and even overseas, companies scrambled to revise not only their public policies, but their internal cultures. News outlets tracked the rise of the Brooks Standard as it spread beyond airlines into hotels, banks, rental agencies, and even corporate offices. For the first time in years, businesses realized that customers were no longer willing to accept surface-level change. They demanded proof. And Nathan's quiet, methodical pressure had given them the language and the courage to ask for it. Nathan's nonprofit organization officially launched under the name Skyline Trust, and within its first month, it signed partnerships with several major international corporations. Skyline Trust would oversee unbiased audits, release public scorecards, and empower everyday people to hold powerful companies accountable. The press tried to call Nathan an activist, a disruptor, a corporate rebel. He refused all the labels. He didn't care what they called him. The work was the only thing that mattered. He hired a small but fierce team, lawyers, auditors, advocates, all of whom understood that changing a system was not about shouting the loudest. It was about showing up every day, every meeting, every boardroom, and refusing to back down when easy compromises were offered. Nathan attended each meeting himself, sitting across from executives who once would have dismissed a teenager in a hoodie without a second thought, and watched them now scramble to explain how they would meet the new expectations. Meanwhile, the original airline continued to struggle. Despite their public pledges and frantic reforms, their brand had been damaged. Customers remembered. Word of mouth spread faster than any press release. Every time someone booked a flight, every time someone made a choice, the memory of what had happened lived just beneath the surface. The airline's new leadership quietly reached out to Nathan's organization, hoping to collaborate and rebuild trust. Nathan agreed, but on strict terms: total transparency, full public access to results, no exceptions. One crisp morning, Nathan stood before a packed auditorium at an industry conference, invited not as a token guest, but as the keynote speaker. Hundreds of executives, employees, students, and journalists sat in silence, waiting for him to speak. He stepped onto the stage and, to no one's surprise, the same black hoodie he had worn on that first flight. He didn't use a prepared script. He didn't need one. "I didn't start this," he began, his voice calm, filling the room without shouting. "It started the first time someone decided what I could or couldn't be just by looking at me. It started the first time someone decided that dignity was something you had to earn based on how you looked, how you dressed, or where you came from." He paused, letting the words settle over the audience. "I'm not here because I want attention. I'm here because I want change, and I'm telling you now, it's not enough to apologize after you get caught. It's not enough to promise better training. You have to mean it. You have to live it. Every day, even when no one is watching." The auditorium stayed perfectly still. Nathan's voice grew firmer. "Because if you don't," he said, "someone will. Someone younger. Someone stronger. Someone braver. They will come, and they will demand what should have never needed demanding in the first place: respect, fairness, dignity." He finished simply, "And next time it won't just be one airline facing the consequences. It will be every company that thought it could get away with doing nothing." The applause that followed wasn't wild or chaotic. It was deep, sustained, heavy with meaning. People stood, not just to clap, but to show that they understood, or at least that they wanted to. Later that day, standing at the edge of the conference building overlooking the bustling city streets, Nathan allowed himself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. He knew the work was far from over. There would be resistance, backtracking, empty promises. But there would also be progress. Real, stubborn, undeniable progress. He watched as people moved below, travelers dragging their suitcases, business people rushing to meetings, families laughing as they hailed taxis. In that simple, messy, beautiful movement of the city, he saw the reason why it all mattered. Because dignity wasn't something that belonged to the few. It belonged to everyone. And as long as Nathan Brooks had a voice, a name, and the will to use them, no one would be able to take that away again. The world had changed, not because someone gave permission, but because someone refused to be pushed aside. And the echo of that refusal would ring through every gate, every terminal, every boardroom, not just for today, but for all the days to come. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories coming soon.